Hello, let me present the Chapter 8 overview of photosynthesis. Photosynthesis can be defined as the conversion of light energy into chemical energy. And there are two types. Anoxygenic does not produce oxygen. There are 4 bacterial groups that use this method: purple, green sulfur, green non-sulfur, and heliobacteria. And the second type of photosynthesis is oxygenic. Of course, that means it produces oxygen. And the organisms that do this type are cyanobacteria, 7 groups of algae, and of course, the one we're most familiar with, and that's plants. Let's begin with taking a look at the summary equation for photosynthesis. Hopefully this will look familiar to you. It is the opposite, essentially, of the aerobic respiration summary equation that we went over in Chapter 7. So this is a balanced redox reaction, and what's happening is you will notice the 6 carbon dioxide that you start out with are being reduced into a glucose molecule, so they're gaining electrons and hydrogens, and the water molecules are being oxidized into oxygen. You may also notice that it started with 12 water molecules and you get 6 water molecules at the end, so you might think, why don't you just cancel out 6 of those water molecules and just have 6 at the beginning and none at the end? But 6 are made out of this process. They are not part of the original water molecules that the process began with. I hope that's not too confusing for you. This being the summary equation for the metabolic pathway of photosynthesis, we can break down this series of reactions into 2 separate sets. We call them the light-dependent reactions and the light-independent reactions. The light-dependent reactions are dependent on light because they capture energy from sunlight and they use that energy to make ATP and to reduce something called NADP+. So NADP+, very similar to the NAD+ that you saw in cellular respiration. So you can remember this. The one that has the P is the one that belongs in photosynthesis. So it essentially does the same job. It is an electron carrier. It'll pick up electrons and hydrogens. So it gets reduced to NADPH, and it will carry those electrons further along in the process, so we'll see that later. The second set of reactions, the light-independent reactions, are also known as carbon fixation, and they involve a process known as the Calvin cycle. And this set of reactions uses the NADPH and the ATP generated in the light-dependent reactions. It uses that energy to synthesize organic molecules from carbon dioxide gas. Before we get into the nitty-gritty detail of the 2 sets of reactions, let's review the anatomy of a chloroplast. Okay, so we have a double-membraned organelle with an outer and inner membrane, and then within that there is a fluid-filled space known as the stroma, and packed into that fluid-filled space is another membrane called the thylakoid membrane that's folded into stacks known as granum or grana, and these stacks are interconnected. Now, within this thylakoid membrane, there are pigments. Pigments are protein molecules that absorb a specific type of light. And they're clustered together, these pigments, into groups known as photosystems within this thylakoid membrane. To get a better grasp on how these pigments work, we need to talk a little bit about the biophysics of light. So let me shrink this down so we can see it a little better. Okay. The entire range of radiant energy coming from the sun is called the electromagnetic spectrum. That is what you're looking at here. It behaves as both particles and waves. The intensity of the energy can be differentiated by its wavelength, measured in nanometers. A wavelength is the distance from the peak of one wave to the peak of the next wave. So this distance here is known as a wavelength. It's a symbol, looks like an upside down Y, and it's measured in nanometers. The closer together the waves, the smaller the wavelength and the more intense the energy. The further apart the waves, the larger the wavelength and the less intense the energy. So the really high intensive energy are known as gamma rays, and the really low intensive energy are radio waves. Somewhere in the middle you'll see is the wavelengths that our eyes are actually capable of receiving and interpreting as visible light. And we know that visible light spectrum as the Roy G. Biv rainbow, right? Roy G. Biv. So R is red, O is orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet. Those wavelengths run from 400 nanometers, which is in the violet end, all the way up to 740 nanometers, which is in the red range. So red is the lower intense energy, and violet is the higher intense visible light energy. If we think of light as particles, we call those particles photons, or photons of light, and they act as discrete bundles of energy. And a photon can carry more energy at a shorter wavelength than it can at the longer wavelength. When photons strike an object, such as a leaf, they can either be absorbed by the leaf, reflected, or transmitted, which means passed through. The pigments in the thylakoid membrane are able to absorb some of that light energy, but not all of it. And we can look at, this is the spectrum of absorption for the pigments in a leaf. This graph shows 3 pigments found in a leaf and their absorption spectrum, what photons of light they absorb and what they don't. You can see the carotenoids, that's what makes carrots orange, that's where they get their name. In the gray line, the black line is chlorophyll A and the dotted line is chlorophyll B. And they actually have, their peaks are offset so that they can absorb more light and thus increase the amount of energy that they're absorbing. But what you do notice here, what's most noticeable, is this dip for all the pigments in the green range. And actually that's why leaves are green, because they're reflecting that green light, and that's what our eyes pick up, while they're absorbing the blues and the reds. It turns out that chlorophyll A is the primary pigment. Chlorophyll B and the carotenoids are known as accessory pigments, and they increase the range of wavelengths that can be used in photosynthesis. And this energy that's being absorbed is all redirected into a chlorophyll A molecule, and we'll see that when we look at those clusters or photosystems of pigments. This graph also explains why you see those brilliant colors in the fall when leaves begin to die as the plant goes dormant. The first thing that happens is the plant stops producing chlorophyll, which is the pigment that absorbs in the reds and the blues and reflects the greens. And then the other pigments are more visible, the carotenoids, and you can see brilliant reds and oranges and yellows because they're no longer being absorbed, they're being reflected out. Okay, so now that we know how light is absorbed by pigments, let's look at how a photosystem works. Alright, so this is the image from your book. This is on the thylakoid membrane, and this is a photosystem here with all its little pigments. You can see the little round green things are the pigments. Light strikes the photosystem in the leaf, and energy is absorbed by these pigment molecules. And as they absorb their energy, they actually pass that energy along into what's known as the reaction center. Okay, so the reaction center is usually a single chlorophyll A molecule. And once this reaction center absorbs enough energy to excite an electron will be ejected out of that reaction center and gets accepted by an electron acceptor. The Reaction center now needs another electron, so there's a donor which will donate its electron to the reaction center so it can then go through this process again. So the pigments that gather all the energy and pass it to the reaction center are known as the antenna complex, and then the single chlorophyll molecule here is known as the reaction center. So far we've covered up through section 8.4 of chapter 8. I'm going to end this video here and continue with the chapter 8 material in a new video. Thanks for watching.